Så mens teknikken lige bliver ordnet herover, så vil jeg ganske kort byde velkommen til det næste, der skal ske. Vi har fået besøg af Paul Cobb og Cara Jackson, som i mange år har arbejdet med, man kan ligesom sige, hvad skal der til for at lykkes med at forbedre undervisningen sådan i større skala. Det er sådan oversættelsen fra deres egen arbejde. Paul er pensioneret. Han er professor emeritus ved Vanderbilt University. Han har været pensioneret i 8 år, men er stadigvæk yderst aktiv og har arbejdet inden for det her felt hele sit liv. Cara Jackson, hun er noget yngre. Jeg kender ikke hendes præcis alder, men hun har også arbejdet med det samme område her i hvert fald i 20 år. Og de har blandt andet arbejdet meget tæt sammen i det, der hedder MIST-projektet, som de selv vil fortælle lidt mere om lige om lidt. Hvad det består af et meget, meget stort forskningsprojekt, forsknings- og udviklingsprojekt, hvor man på en anden måde end traditionelt har involveret sig i praksisfeltet, både blandt i det her tilfælde lærere, men også på ledelses- og administrationsniveau, altså på forvaltningsniveau. De vil fortælle, prøve at opsummere resultaterne fra både deres forskning, men også anden forskning, som taler ind i det her. Så på en måde så vil de prøve at give deres samlede blik på, hvad det er, der skal til, for at man i et undervisningssystem kan lykkes med at udvikle matematikundervisningen i større skala. Velkommen til Paul Cobb og Cara Jackson.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and we really appreciate greatly the invitation to be here and to talk today. And we'll just get the slides up. As you will see when we do, we have one of the more horrendous titles you'll see. Here it comes. And so I want to unpack this as a first step. The theme we're asked to talk about, which we're very happy to, is critical conditions for students and teachers' learning. Next part, quite a mouthful, so let's break it down. When we say identifying high-quality teaching practices, the criterion, one of the key criterions for us for a teaching practice to be high quality is that if a teacher develops such practice, it will immediately lead to improvements in students' learning opportunities. Not next year, not a month from now, but immediately. And we're going to give examples of such practices. When we talk about high quality teacher education practices, in this context, teacher education means in-service teacher education. Teachers who are already practicing in schools. High quality teacher education practices are practices of teacher educators. If teacher educators develop such practices, they improve teachers' learning opportunities. They improve teachers' opportunities to improve their practice and get better at supporting students to learn some worthwhile mathematics. So that's the background to where we're coming from, and we're going to argue each of these, identifying and supporting teachers and teacher educators' development of such practices is a critical condition. And I hope that's reasonably obvious why we want to make that focus. Here's our agenda for this morning. It's a 2-part presentation once I finish the intro. Briefly, the work we're going to report in large part grows out of a large project Cara and I did together with a number of other people that aim to investigate what it takes to improve math teaching and learning on a large scale. Not in one classroom, not in one school, but across a large number of schools. And what we're going to do so we're going to share background information on that project, which is called the MIST project, just enough that you need. You don't need to know the project as an end in itself. Then Cara's going to take over and focus initially on teaching practices. And she's going to clarify what we mean by the importance of specifying such practices, those high-quality teaching practices in sufficient detail. And she's also going to talk about the importance of articulating or specifying student learning goals and a vision of high-quality math teaching that orients that instructional improvement effort. Then we're going to take a short break at that point, which we think will be halfway through or just a bit over the talking part of this morning. Then I will come back and I will focus on, from the MIST, a coherent system of supports for teachers' learning And in particular, I'll say a few words about what we take as characteristics of high quality instructional materials or teaching materials. And I will argue that such teachers having such materials as tools to support students' learning is a critical condition for the improvement of teaching and learning. And then the bulk of what I will talk about focuses on those high quality teacher education practices. So that's the game plan. Oh yes, I'll do it.
Okay, sorry.
He's right. Here's the problem. I'm using the word instruction a lot. It's deeply ingrained. That's how we talk in the US. Please understand, when we say instruction there, we mean what you mean by teaching. We don't mean direct instruction. We mean teaching broadly defined. And as you will see, when Kara gets to her part of the presentation, it's inquiry-oriented teaching. It may seem very strange to you, but we will quite happily talk about inquiry-oriented instruction. We will talk about instruction improvement, which means for us improving the quality of teaching. And we try very hard to say teaching, but it's very hard for us. It's deeply ingrained when we're trying to remember what we're trying to say coherently. So thank you for that clarification. So where are we? So yeah, that's the agenda. So first of all, we've got to say a few words about the US education system, simply as background, if we're talking about instructional improvement on a large scale. The US has a very decentralized system. That means we have separate school districts, each of which has considerable control over mathematics teaching from grades kindergarten all the way through grade 12. I looked this up the other day and it still amazes me. There's 13,200 school districts in the US approximately, a lot. Many of those are pretty small rural districts, 1,000 or less students. But we have some large urban districts, city districts. You would have heard of the names of the places, of course. New York, Los Angeles, St. Louis, places like that, with 100,000 or more students. So when Kara and I think about instruction improvement at scale, the biggest administrative unit that we can cope with, makes sense, are these large urban districts. Something else to know about the United States, from 2004 on, each state was required to specify learning goals or state standards in mathematics for grades 3 through 8. This is what students are expected to learn at the end of grade 5 and so on. And assessments. Those have shifted began to shift, the state assessments in particular, and shift from initially very procedurally oriented to more conceptually oriented around 2012. The reason we're telling you this, these aren't just sort of people getting data to find out what's happening. They have real teeth. Schools have given targets each year that they're expected to meet. And if they don't, eventually, and we know a number of schools where this happened, they're reconstituted, meaning everybody lost their jobs and then they start over hiring new staff. So it's pretty draconian. Please understand, we're not advocating that for anywhere else, but that's the reality of the context in which we work, but particularly the people we work with, our partners, teachers, school leaders, district leaders work. And so they have a lot of stress to cope with. With those shifting standards from procedures, major student learning goals change, right? The quality of them, conceptual understanding and procedural fluency. And by procedural fluency, we don't just mean quick, smooth, we also mean flexible. So students can have a conceptual understanding of why procedures work and they can adapt them to new problem situations. Problem solving, where a key for problem solving for us is that students have to analyze the task or the task situation mathematically in order to figure out a solution strategy. And Kara will give our examples of this in her presentation in a minute. And also mathematical communication, students being able to communicate their mathematical reasoning to the teacher, but especially to other students orally and also in writing, in written form. They write little reports to a fictitious audience or an audience in a task situation, that sort of thing, where they using mathematical argumentation to make a recommendation. So the implication of those shift in goals is a significant change in what counts as high quality teaching. Remember, for us, what counts as high quality teaching is relative to student learning opportunities. And we know for sure those type of teaching practices require, in the US at least, very substantial teacher learning. So when we think about instructional improvement at scale, we're thinking about supporting the learning of a large number of students across multiple schools. So that's the sort of background to the work we engaged in the MIST project. And how do we do that? Well, we partnered with initially with four large districts that served 360,000 students. And again, these are sort of, the largest I think was 140,000 students, so pretty big. After a swift 4 years, we continued with two districts, and because we wanted to do more, in particular, we ended up co-designing and co-leading with district leaders professional development for math coaches. I'll explain what those folks are in a minute, and also for school leaders specific to mathematics, so they hopefully could support the instructional improvement efforts in their buildings. So that's the background to this. There's one thing that's very important to know. We started in 2007, procedurally oriented tests. We were able to recruit 4 districts that weren't just aiming at those low-level tests. They were aiming high, so they were 5 or 6 years ahead of the curve in terms of the change. The reason why we did that, we wanted to have a partnership where what the districts were attempting to do fit with our research agenda. And that meant that we could contribute to and add value to the district's improvement efforts. In other words, we weren't just collecting data, thank you very much. It's also, yes, we want to get data, we want to find out what's going on, but how can we add value? And so what we did every year, and I'm not going to go through the details of this, but it's a huge effort, we developed evidence-based reports to each district, and we first of all documented what their improvement strategies were for that year. It might be, for example, to have carve out time in the school day for teachers, math teachers, to meet in the building, maybe once a week or whatever, to work on issues of instruction. We would collect data to find out how those improvement strategies were playing out. So we would want to know what's happening in those meetings. We would be interviewing all of the teachers. If there was a coach in the meeting, we would interview the coach and so on. We would compile all that data and would then write a report. These were about 15 single-spaced pages each. Each one was unique to their improvement strategies, which says, here's your strategy for this year. Here's how it's playing out. And oftentimes it was different than what they intended. Here's why we think it's playing out this way. Here are specific actionable recommendations on how you can adjust your improvement strategies to make them more effective. And across those 8 years of data collection, we made 162 specific recommendations, it happens. We limited them to 3 or 4 per year. We could have made far more, but that's what's feasible for the district to do. And of those, it turns out that they attempted to act on almost 2/3 of them. And I have to tell you, we were amazed that they saw them as that valuable. I would just say, by the end of it, these feedback sessions became a big deal, where they would have district leaders from all departments, and it wasn't us giving presentations. From the very first ones, we refused to do exactly what I'm doing now, actually. We sat around a circle of tables, and we gave them summary documents, and we talked through it together. And we know it was going well when the district leaders started talking to each other about what this meant for their work the following school year. So that's the background to what we did. The only reason I'm telling you all of this is because I want you to explain that what we're going to talk about is evidence-based. There's a lot of data here, and we analysed all of it. Who are our subjects? In each district, 30 math teachers, and we're focusing on middle grades, ages 12 to 14-year-old students. The coaches that serve those schools, the school leaders who have focused on mathematics, and district leaders across 5 different central office units. It worked out at about 50 people a district, 200 participants. When we went down to 2 districts, we doubled the number of people in each district. That was to have adequate statistical power, because we were doing both quantitative and qualitative analyses. Here's the sort of data we collected, compiled over these years. 1,700 audio recorded interviews, and we coded all of them. We had concomitant associated surveys that would address issues and complement the interviews. For the teachers, we obviously were interested in the quality of their instruction. We used a particular protocol, and for each teacher each year, we recorded 2 consecutive lessons and those were all coded using a protocol not developed by us but was available, called Instructional Quality Improvement, and focuses much more on the quality of students' learning opportunities, not teaching as just a performance. So 1,900 videos, and we used to bring in a crew of folks who are in the master's program to become math teachers to do that code. And I can go through all of this, you know, professional mathematical knowledge for teaching, assessments, and so on, including we had the student achievement data from the district. Admittedly, in the first years, that was on procedurally oriented tests. So that's the sort of background to what we're going to talk about. A lot of people are involved in this effort. That's not at one time, that's over the course of the project, either in the you can see doctoral students, postdocs, and so on. So that's our background. And what came out of all of this? What came out of it was what we call a coherent instructional system as the core of it. And you can see it's got 4 very broad components. In the middle there, the little blue circle, are learning goals. Those are student learning goals, mathematical learning goals for students. Why is that in the center? For us, what drives everything is the focus on student learning. We start there with what are the learning goals? How are they specified? What are we trying to achieve? What does that then mean, drawing on available research in mathematics, education, and related field for what instruction should look like? A vision of high quality instruction that's specified in sufficient detail. Why sufficient detail? So it specifies learnable teaching practices. I caught myself once, look at that. So learning goals, vision of high quality instruction. That orients the whole improvement effort. We're going to talk a little bit about, at some point, instructional materials, then as a support for teachers' learning, a particular type of support. Assessments, formative assessments. We're going to dwell quite a bit on that top segment, the dark blue, the navy blue segment, what we call a teacher learning subsystem, or short for a system of supports for teachers' learning. And that includes pull-out professional development. What many of us think about when we just hear the word professional development. Groups of teachers leave their classrooms, they go to an agreed upon location, and there might be sessions for an hour and a half or 2 hours after school every Wednesday for, I don't know, 6 weeks or maybe a whole semester or something. Or perhaps it's built into the school day. Mathematics coaching, and at least when we're going to talk about them for the purposes of this talk, coaching, many districts now hire coaches or attempt to develop teachers to become coaches, and they're charged with working one-on-one with teachers in their classrooms to help them, or try to help them, improve their instruction. I've already mentioned teacher collaborative time was also very common. All 4 of our districts at some point focused on math coaching. They also allocated time during the school day for teachers, math teachers, not teachers in general, to meet to work on instructional issues. And we also focused on teacher networks. We were interested in who teachers turned to for advice about teaching, and then what was the position of that person, and then we would also check out, is that person's teaching more advanced than the teacher talking to them? Does that make a difference? And I will just tell you, yes, it does. And so on. And then the last piece is the orange piece, supplemental supports for currently struggling students. We had not even thought about this when we started all this work. None of the districts had this as part of their plans, but every one of the 35 schools in which we collected data had programs for students they perceived were currently struggling. And we had a student do an analysis of these. Nearly all of those programs were totally ineffective, but some were actually harmful. And so we wanted to put this in, and the position we have come to in the course of this, of watching what these districts are doing, is that this is a huge area that needs future work, which is why we're highlighting it. In any instructional regime, there's going to be kids who are not being served right now. And at least when we talk about, we're going to talk in a minute about ambitious instruction, inquiry-oriented instruction, that includes the type of instruction we all like. And so then what should we do? And right now, there's very little guidance, very little evidence, and schools, at least in our country, are flailing around and doing totally unproductive things. So that's going to be where I'm going to stop the introduction and turn over to Kara. How do I turn this off?
You ready? Okay. Hello, I will echo Paul's just gratitude and thanks for having us here. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Paul indicated, I'm going to start now with what's at the heart of the coherent instructional system, the learning goals and vision of teaching. And our intent here is to really focus on the importance of being able to specify in some detail, we'll use the language of sufficient detail, both those goals that are domain specific, but also what it is we're trying to accomplish, what's our aspirations for what should happen between teachers and students in school, with the argument that the more detailed we can be around details that actually make a difference for kids' learning, the better it is that we can actually set goals for ourselves that are feasible and realizable and be able to know whether or not we're making the progress that we intend. So I will start us here. Clicker, there we go. So Paul mentioned the learning goals that our partner districts were articulating that have become instantiated in standards in the US, for example, and our understanding is that these goals are consistent with also the Danish curriculum and the aspirations of the Danish educational system. So as Paul said, focusing on not just learning a procedure, but being able to become fluent with procedures, to be flexible, to be able to make decisions about what it is you choose to do, when and why and how. Developing conceptual understanding, so that deep understanding of key mathematical ideas in a range of domains, number and operations, algebra, data, probability, geometry, and so forth. Paul also mentioned the importance of problem solving, so really being able to analyze problem situations and know why particular solution strategies would make sense given the conditions that are in a particular problem. And then, of course, that developing the ability to communicate effectively about mathematics, not just to show what you know, but to actually learn through the act of communicating. So learning through both verbal discourse, but also written discourse. And as we think about this work of trying to really get specific around learning goals, what we want to be thinking about here is not just having students learn how to do something, but to actually start to be able to reason in particular ways and communicate about those ideas. So up here on the right, support students' development of specific ways of reasoning and communicating. For us, at least in our context, this represents a significant shift from what's happening in most classrooms. In a lot of classrooms, the goal is around learning how to do a particular thing on a particular day and a particular lesson. And what we're suggesting is super important here when we're trying to improve teaching and learning in the long term and in relationship to these kinds of goals, that we really need to be thinking in a broader vision here around how are we supporting this development of ways of reasoning across a longer period of time that will be enduring for students. So it's asking questions like, what are the big ideas of this particular mathematical domain? So in early algebra, for example, what are the really big ideas of what we want students wrestling with and making sense of? What does it sound like or look like to really reason about those ideas? What would count as an effective explanation or justification in that particular area? We'll say a little bit more about this when we get into some specific tasks, but I think the thing to hold on to here is to just sort of consider when we're going into planning lessons, for example, what's our vision in terms of, are we focused on the near and immediate, or do we have a longer term vision of what we're trying to accomplish with students, and how specific is that vision? Against those learning goals then, and again, my understanding is this is consistent with the work that people are working on in this country as well, there's an international body of research that has suggested ways of teaching that will allow us to reach those sorts of ambitious goals. And you'll see up here, we're going to use this image throughout this presentation of considering a lesson. Imagine this is a particular lesson unfolding in a series of phases across the lesson. And we're also going to use the name here, Vision of Ambitious and Equitable Mathematics Teaching. And I want to say a little bit about that. So we also on the goals talked about ambitious goals. Why ambitious? At least again, in our context, because it represents a significant shift from what's typically happening in most classrooms. So it's ambitious in the sense of you're trying to achieve something that is currently not the norm. It goes against the norm of how schooling has been organized and what happens in classrooms. It's also ambitious in terms of the kinds of understandings that we're hoping students develop. So really those deep, enduring understandings that support them in schooling, career, but also in life, in engaging in problem solving and so forth in the world. We also found, or we feel committed to, but also have found the importance of thinking about the vision as not only ambitious, but also naming that it's also equitable. As Paul mentioned, at least again within the US context, there's a long history of a number of students not being served well in classrooms, and it often reflects inequities in the broader society. And what we've really come to the position is that it's actually our work. We need to figure out what are the forms of teaching that can support all students to really substantially participate in each of the phases of the lesson so that they're able to be developing, again, those longer term ambitious goals for their learning. And so we'll focus on this today. Imagine you have a unit of instruction, you have your longer term goals of what you're trying to accomplish, and then you have the lessons. The first thing that we think is really important to think about is what's the particular task that you're going to use with students. And students, of course, will learn what it is that we give them opportunities to learn. And in our case, in the US, it's often typical that the task itself is not aligned with the kinds of goals that we're hoping to be able to support students to engage in. And so the first piece up here you'll see is selecting. The term we'll use today is a challenging task. And I want to give us a minute to just think about that. So, put two tasks up here. I'm going to use the language of routine tasks, meaning what's usually happening, and challenging task. And on your handout, there's 3 tasks. You can just focus on the first and the third for now. Just take a minute and look at those 2 tasks and just think to yourself what's similar and what's different about them. You might also think about how similar or different is this to the work that I typically do if you're in a classroom setting.
Can you ask if somebody's not having that? Then I can...
Oh, if anybody doesn't have the handout, anybody? Okay. And feel free to talk with a person near you about what you're noticing. So put up these 2 tasks here, and there's lots one could notice about the 2 tasks, the differences between them, the similarities and so forth. We'll focus particularly on what we want to analyze mathematically about the task. In other words, what is it that students need to know and to do to solve the task, and what kinds of mathematics can be learned through working on these tasks. And I'll just make a few distinctions up here. In this first task, again, using that language of routine, what typically has happened, one thing that's true is that, at least what we typically see, is students sort of have learned a procedure to just apply to solve this task. So it's focusing on volume. They're likely just to go ahead and multiply the 3 numbers that they see there. And usually sort of stop there, maybe not really making sense of what would that actually mean? What does it mean to actually find the volume? There's little ambiguity as to what to do. Typically in this task, again, teachers have already taught students the procedure to apply to solve it. And as I said before, this is what we see in a lot of lessons, and we know that it does not end up supporting the kind of understandings that we were talking about in terms of ambitious goals for students' learning. If that's the majority of the kind of work you're doing in mathematics, we're not going to reach those goals. This task here, again, there's lots one could say about it, but at least from a mathematical perspective, In order to figure out what to do, I really have to analyze the problem situation. I have to make sense of this bathtub, it's being filled at a particular rate. What is that rate? What does it mean that every 2 minutes, 15 gallons are accumulating in the tub? I also have to think about at what point am I going to turn the water off? Once the water is going to be filled, we want to fill it up to 3/4 of the way full. What does that mean? Can I picture what's happening there? To be able to help me then figure out what strategy I would use and why that strategy would actually make sense. These characteristics here on the right of students needing to analyze problems in order to figure out a strategy to use, explaining why their strategy makes sense, those are the kind of key characteristics that we're referring to when we think about using the language of challenging tasks. And again, it's not that you would necessarily have this sort of task every single day, but if the majority of the time students are doing tasks on the left, we're not going to reach those particular kinds of learning goals for students. So the kinds of teaching that we're talking about today is starting with these sorts of challenging tasks. And I want to mark then, starting with that task is one thing. It's also very possible to implement that task and still then tell students what to do to solve it and walk through a set of strategies. So there's a lot of work that then happens over the course of that lesson that we appreciate as incredibly complex work on the part of teachers and teaching. And that's the work we're going to really dig in today to try to specify in sufficient detail. Starting with this sort of challenging task and being able to maintain that challenge represents a significant shift, again, in what typically happens. Often on the left, the way we think about lessons as we're just trying to get students to solve tasks, we think, what do students need to do to solve this task? And my goal is to do that by the end of the period, the end of the lesson. Again, if we take this goal of supporting students' development of specific ways of reasoning and communicating over the long term, then the question becomes really, what significant mathematics can students learn by or learn through actually working on this task? They're learning as they're working. You're not using the task to demonstrate what I already know. And that shift is a profound one, at least in our experience, it's incredibly profound, and it has implications then for the work of teaching. So back to this, thinking about the phases of a lesson, assuming you've selected a challenging task, then again, trying to accomplish those ambitious goals for students' learning, the next thing we think about then is how am I going to introduce or launch that task? And launch, we think of like a rocket launching, like how do you propel people forward into the task? Critically, if we're trying to have students learn through the task to really engage in that reasoning, we need to not then tell students how to solve the task at the very start of the lesson. Instead, the work becomes really supporting students to imagine what's happening in that task situation, like the bathtub. Our goal is so that students understand what the problem is asking, so that they can then wrestle with the important mathematics through the lesson, and we ensure that the kids are the ones doing the thinking, not the teacher for them. Again, incredibly complex work. I hope that it's clear how much we appreciate just how difficult doing this kind of work is in classrooms. I'm going to spend more time in this phase in just a minute, so we'll come back to the launch. Imagine now the students are working, and they might work individually, they might work with other students. Here, it becomes really important, again, if the students are engaging in the task, it's not so much that they need to get the right answer, but that they are actually making meaning of the particular mathematical ideas that are under consideration. And in order for that to happen, we know, again, this is grounded in a lot of research on teaching, it's important that norms and routines have been established so that students actually see value in wrestling with ideas and sharing tentative, exploratory ideas with one another, and asking each other to explain their reasoning, and that the teacher's playing a critical role in this phase. They're not just stepping back and letting students go. they're observing really carefully and eliciting and asking students questions so that they're assessing how are students making sense of the ideas here, the important mathematical ideas, so that I can plan for a following conclusion, a following discussion of students' solutions. This phase here then, that whole class discussion, again, if I think about what happens in a lot of our US classrooms, when we have these whole class discussions, they focus on what was the answer, did you get it right or wrong? But again, through that, students are not actually learning, they're assessing whether or not they got something right. From this perspective, where you're trying to support, again, the ways of reasoning and communicating about important mathematical ideas, the teacher now is selecting and sequencing particular student ideas to really ensure that the key mathematical ideas are at the heart of the discussion and that you're actually, again, pushing forward students' learning. So the discussion is not a place to demonstrate what I already know. It's both to share what I know so far and to be able to deepen students' various understandings. So in here, the teacher's pressing students to explain and justify their reasoning, make connections between particular solution strategies, and so forth. Again, always in relationship to what's the key mathematical ideas that we're developing, again, over time. Critically, it's not that we need to get all students to the same place by the end of that lesson. And this, again, at least in our perspective, or our experience, is a profound shift. To say it's okay that not all students are at the same place, and at the same time, back to the focus on equity, we don't want to leave particular students behind. And so, again, wrestling through just the complexity of this work. So what I'm going to do in this next little bit is try to walk us through an illustration to really try to make alive this idea of what we mean by detailing ambitious and equitable teaching in a sufficient enough way that it's helpful for us as both teachers and as people who support teachers' learning, and around issues or around aspects of teaching that make a critical difference for students' learning, as Paul said, that make an immediate difference for students' learning. So to do that, we're going to dig into the launch. We're going to focus here on the launch of tasks, and I'll say a little bit why. So we were really curious in our districts that we were working with that very first year. We were interested in trying to detail, again, the equitable mathematics teaching. We were interested in this issue of when you aim for ambitious goals for students' learning, what's the additional or special work you do to try to ensure that all students are able to substantially participate in a lesson. And what we saw from really that year one was in looking at videos that were collected, you could essentially predict in the first 5 or 7 minutes whether or not, I'm going to draw on Paul's language, all students were in the game. Were they all in the midst of making sense of important mathematical ideas, or were a lot of them on the outside of what was happening? And we, through looking at these videos, realized how it is that you launch a challenging task is so, so important. Because you're either setting up for students to be able to really access and engage, or you're not. You end up actually creating it so that the kids who kind of already knew a lot keep going, and the ones who were struggling prior to this continue to struggle. So we looked at these video recordings and looked at ones that represented range of what we would say of high quality access, I guess, to the main mathematical ideas. And in these videos, as Paul was describing earlier, the teachers had intentionally tried to implement what we would call a challenging task, and they all had a concluding whole class discussion. So they launched, students worked, and there was a discussion. To say a little bit more about why the launch matters, it was impacting the work of students, as I've said, whether or not they could engage meaningfully, whether or not they could then actually participate in the whole class discussion. But it also impacted the work of teachers. So I don't know if people in here have had this experience. I certainly have. You engage students, you put forth a task, people don't really know what you want them to do, and you end up going from table to table trying to recreate your explanation of what it is you meant to do. This was happening in a number of the classrooms. And what it meant was the teacher also was then not able to step back and really plan carefully for the whole class discussion. So we identified this aspect of a lesson as being really critical for reaching ambitious goals and also for issues of equity. And we decided to try to see if we could specify what seemed really important about the launch such that other people could learn to do it. And so I'm going to pause again and have you all engage in some work. So if you flip to 2A,
That's the same document.
yes, yeah. Let me explain what we're going to do. There is a QR code if you prefer electronic. However, I have to make one addendum, so don't start for a minute. So essentially, if we've got 2 tasks in here, you can choose if you want to focus on an elementary task or a secondary task. The elementary is called 5 Monkeys and 2 Trees. The secondary is called Dollars for Dancing. The first comes from work that Paul had been engaged in from a while back, and the Dollars for Dancing comes from one of our teachers' classrooms in the partner district. I'm going to ask that you first anticipate at least 2 or 3 ways that students might approach or solve the task, given the long-term goal that's there, but I need to correct one of these in a minute. And then to really focus on what do you think students would need to understand in order to just begin to work meaningfully on that task. What would you want them to understand about the task situation prior to starting if your goal is to have all of your students being able to make sense of the task enough to start to work with important mathematical ideas? Not necessarily get the right answer right away, but to really start to actually engage with the mathematics. The one thing I have to note, Paul doesn't know this, is that I realized on the elementary task that's in here, by accident I copied over the secondary goal on there. So on the elementary, it's a grade 1 task. It's 6 or 7 year olds, and the long-term learning goal here was flexible partitioning of small quantities. So for example, being able to see 5 as the same as 4 and 1, 3 and 2, 0 and 5, and so forth. So I'll leave this up in a minute for anyone who's in the elementary group. Just so you know, the secondary task was a grade 7 classroom, 12 or 13-year-olds. The long-term learning goal was investigating and comparing linear relationships, using equations, tables, and graphs as tools. And just a bit of context for you, thinking about this, that's the long-term learning goal. This particular task is that the 7th grade students first encounter with a linear relationship with non-zero y-intercepts. So where the y-intercept is at something other than 0. So let me put this back for a minute, and then I'll put the elementary task back up. So if you could just think with a colleague again, find somebody who's interested in elementary or secondary, 2 to 3 ways students might approach or solve the task, given the goal. And then again, what would students need to understand just to begin to work meaningfully on the task? Good? Okay, we'll take about like 4 minutes or so. And I'll put that, there's the goal for the elementary task. Okay. I just want to interrupt for a minute because the next thing we're going to ask you to do, you can go ahead and do if you're ready, which is you've now thought about the task, you've thought about how students might solve it, and you've given some thought to what is it you would want them to understand before working, but such that you haven't told them what to do, that they're still engaged in the task. The next bit is we're now going to give you a transcript of a launch of each of those tasks, of what a teacher did or might do to launch those tasks. So in the handout, if you just keep turning, 3A is the elementary one, the monkeys, And then if you go to 3B, you'll find the Dollars for Dancing launch. So as you're ready, take a minute, or a few minutes, and read over the launch of that. And then what we'd like you to think is, as you're reading, what is it that the teacher is doing to enable all students to begin, again, by the end of the launch, to begin to work meaningfully on the task? What's the work of the teacher? What are the practices, the moves that the teacher is engaged in? Okay. So the work that you just did is similar to the work we were doing when we were first looking at videos of launches to try to see what do we notice that teachers are doing to really enable students to just start to meaningfully engage with the mathematics. And we, curious to see if this matches onto what you noticed or what other things you all noticed too. One piece is just ensuring that students understand what we refer to as the key contextual features of the scenario. For example, do you know monkeys that they play in trees? Are you making sense of that? Do you know what a dance marathon is in the secondary? And I should say the red is elementary and the blue is the secondary task. Do I have an image of what those are? And I think in both you can see teachers doing work to that. On our read, at least when we first started engaging with this is a part that a lot of people pay attention to do I understand the context? But a thing we noticed that was incredibly important, and I'll share the evidence in a minute, it's also important that we support students to really start to imagine or picture what's happening in the task situation, the thing, whatever is that happened, the actions that are actually becoming mathematized. By that, I mean what's going to be described, represented, analyzed, interpreted mathematically. And so in the monkeys case, it's having an understanding that there are different ways that the monkeys are going to be distributed among the two trees, and that all of the monkeys need to be in those two trees. In the Dollars for Dancing case, you can see the work the teacher's supporting the students to do to understand that there's two different ways of accumulating money over time. They use the language, I think, Sean, it's like you start with something or you've got to earn, you've got to try to get more. So starting with a fixed amount and then or earning a fixed amount every per hour of dancing. In both of those cases, that's what's actually being mathematized, or what the mathematics that the students are going to be working on, trying to really make sense of in the task. The other thing you might have noticed, there was a lot of work on the part of the teachers to support students to develop common language to describe those key aspects. That becomes really important. We conjectured this, and then I'll show we have evidence that indicates this is true. Because then in the small groups and the whole class discussion, students have a common referent. They're able to refer back to this language they've developed to describe, again, what's actually happening mathematically in the task. And then the last thing, I think in both cases, maybe what you didn't see, is the teacher or a student telling students how to solve the task. So critically, how do you maintain the challenge? You don't suggest a solution strategy, but you're also providing access. Again, our respect for how difficult this work is. Incredibly difficult work, and we believe it's learnable. We believe, or we have evidence, that people can actually learn to get better at doing this, and it makes a real difference for students. So I'll end my little piece here, which is we identified those four aspects through doing work like what you just did. We then created a rubric to try to code the launches of the video that we were collecting, and we already had ways of coding the level of the challenge of the task, both at the start and over the course of the lesson, and the quality of what happened in the whole class discussion. And here's what we found, that indeed the quality of what was happening in the launch was positive, related to students' opportunities in the including whole class discussion. By that, we mean in the launch, when there was intentional effort to support students to develop common language, to describe not just the features of the context, but also to imagine what's happening mathematically, you saw greater prevalence of students actually in the whole class discussion offering ideas, but also offering ideas that were conceptual in nature, that were actually referring back to the key quantities of the particular task, were really focused on the main mathematical ideas. That said, we also saw that in 2/3 of the lessons we observed, that the challenge of the task was lowered in that first essentially 5 to 7 minutes. So in 2/3 of the cases, essentially teachers were suggesting to kids how to solve the task, and therefore taking the thinking away from the students, which suggested to us, again, this is a really high leverage area for being able to support us all to get better at being able to do this kind of work if we want to aim for ambitious learning goals for students. If we don't give them the opportunity to wrestle with the mathematics, we're not going to be able to achieve those goals. And so, last little bit here, just stepping back, what we've just done with the launch, that's an illustration of what we mean by trying to specify the work of teaching in sufficient detail, meaning that there's evidence that if you do these particular things, it makes an immediate, real difference for your students' learning. And once you can start to describe it in this sort of detail, you can actually be able to help people learn how to get better at it and to reflect on your own practice to see, you know, what happened in the particular launch that may have led students to be able to engage meaningfully at the start or not. And I think I will pause there, and I think we'll take a break for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. 1:30. Okay, good, thank you.
You just go ahead.
I will do. I'm not proud. I can talk. Okay, so Kara focused on I hope you've got a sense of what we mean by high quality teaching practices. We're going to now shift to begin to think about high quality teacher educator practices, by which we mean folks who are now charged with supporting teachers in getting better, to put it crudely. But before we do that, I want to say just a couple of words about high quality instructional materials. What the heck does that mean? Well, we know several characteristics, not from our research, but just the field in general. We know absolutely, definitely, on the shadow of a doubt, we're talking about coherent instructional series. There's a guy in the US, his name's William Schmidt, and his whole career was compiling evidence about the importance of what he called instructional coherence, meaning coherence of the materials. That means that if we take a task, and like take either of the two tasks you looked at, Dollars for Dancing and the Monkeys in the Trees, that would be one task. Kids begin to reason in a particular way. That's the basis for the next task and the next task. And it worked for many years doing with teachers in classrooms. And the way I came to think about it was, if you want to know what kids learned in one lesson, you look at what they do in the next lesson, and so on. So on the one hand, you're trying to teach them something new in the next lesson, but in a way it's an informal assessment of what they learned in the last lesson, if you see what I mean, what they carry forward. And if we think about it that way, we're on the way to having coherent instructional sequences. That's at the broad level with those broad goals that Kara was talking about. If we get down to the task level, and you saw two, I would think would be reasonably high quality tasks. Some characteristics? Each one of them, there were what we would call multiple entry points. Kids reasoning at different level could begin to engage with the substance, the mathematics, given the support the teacher provided in launching them. It's not just, boom, there's only one way to get into this task. For example, in the Monkeys and the Two Trees, some kids might have just reasoned abstractly about, 3 and 2 and 2 and 3. Others have the little picture there to imagine them moving out. It's that sort of thing we mean, reasoning at different levels. A second thing on the task is there's going to be multiple solutions, but not just any multiple solutions. As Kara also talked about, you get to that whole class discussion. That range of solutions is in effect the material the teacher gets to work with to make sure that the focus of the discussion is on significant mathematical ideas, part-whole relationships, linear relationships, depending on the task, and so on. So you want that range of solutions that can make that possible. Notice, we've now got a number of constraints. I had the good fortune for 10 years to work very closely with folks in the Netherlands on design, instructional design. They were very good. And it was one of the hardest things I ever did. Designing really good instructional materials, and the phrase I've heard it, I like it, is that give teachers a fighting chance is murderous. But the idea that teachers could do the sort of teaching that Kara was talking about before the break without such materials is an absolute pipe dream. An analogy that works for me is this: to think of these materials as tools for teachers can use to support students' learning. I was in the UK just before I came here. I'm originally from the UK and I was visiting relatives. One of my nephews is a carpenter. He reframes buildings and puts in rooms in attics and that sort of thing. He's got his tool bag, right? In fact, he's got a whole truckload of tools. Without those tools, he's sunk. He can't do his job. But on the other hand, just having the tools, and we were to give them to somebody like me, it would be absolutely pointless as well. So on the one hand, the tools are essential, but they don't get you anywhere. You also need somebody who's extremely skilled. And so I find it very helpful as a metaphor to think of instructional tools, materials as tools. And we have to arm teachers with high quality tools. And then if we move on, we can think about teachers developing ambitious and equitable instruction as learning to use these particular types of tools skillfully. What's involved in developing those skills? I think we can say we know absolutely for sure that it's going to involve working closely with somebody who's already relatively accomplished. And as was clarified for me, we always have the problem of translation, we apologize, accomplished means really good at, very sophisticated, a top-level practitioner who's already developed pretty sophisticated, ambitious and equitable instructional practices. And we're going to differentiate the phrase we use for such people who are professional learning leaders, and they might design and lead sequences of professional development sessions. You can imagine snippets. I would say in a way, there's one of them over there, as you saw when Kara was working with you before the break and directing you to look at those transcripts and whatever. And you could imagine her leading a discussion and that leading into getting to activities of designing launches and so on. Second thing that these folks might be charged with doing is facilitating teacher collaborative meetings. I will just mention offhand now, got a lot of data on teacher collaborative meetings from the MISS project, and sometimes districts, God bless them, think if we just schedule time for teachers to work together, magic's going to happen. Sadly, most of the time it doesn't. Why? There's nobody with that expertise. There's no, we would say accomplished practitioners, let's say skilled practitioners in the room, and that's absolutely vital. And they can also charge with working one-on-one with teachers in their classrooms. And the question I have is this: what knowledge or skills or capabilities do professional learning leaders need to support teachers' development of ambitious and equitable instructional practices? I hope that question makes sense. What would you think people need to do? Teaching's challenging. We would say supporting teachers in getting better, developing these ambitious and equitable practices is also. So maybe just take 1 minute to think about that, and then we'll come back together. Okay, what types of skills or knowledge or whatever do they need? Or alternatively, and this is a very real question, in US school districts, you have coaching positions open. What are you looking for when you have folks come in? Okay? So literally 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, let's come back together. Thank you. I'm glad you... Thank you. Now, I wish we had more time so we could have a discussion or collect these. Sadly, we don't. But the reason I wanted to ask you that, because we're going to work on this issue a little more, and I hope that it was useful to at least engage with that activity before we move forward. I will show you not just what people typically say, but also in general, what if you read the research literature, what it says. It says they need to be accomplished teachers. I mean, accomplished, well, yeah. It's very hard to support somebody if you can't do it yourself. They should have developed ambitious and equitable instructional practices. Typically, you see things like they need deep mathematical knowledge, not in general, but for teaching. I think we'd all agree with that, but I would also say so do teachers. That's part of being a very accomplished teacher. And beyond that, people talk about interpersonal skills or social skills, being able to establish trusting relationships with teachers. And for the most part, that's about it. Is that enough? As it turns out, as we carry on, it's not enough. It gets you in the game. You can have good chats with teachers, but you can't necessarily support them in getting better. And I want to illustrate one aspect of that in a minute. This focuses specifically on math coaching. It could have been on facilitators of teacher collaborative time. So we're focused on coaching. What's going to come out of this, I will argue, has greater generality, okay? And it comes out of a little project that followed on from the MIST, in which I was involved. And this was actually in the home district of the city where I'm from, which is, I can say it, I'm sure, Metro Nashville Public Schools, serves 100,000 students. And again, it was a partnership, meaning we don't go in and just do research and say thank you. We collaborate with practitioners, folks in those districts, on problems of mutual interest to us, and you negotiate the focus. And we had planned to focus on teacher collaboration, and they switched, and their focus and their priority became supporting the development of a cadre of accomplished, really good math coaches. And we said, well, that's okay, let's collaborate on that problem. And what we also try to do, work within the constraints of what's feasible for districts. We could go in and we could get grant money and buy a lot of people out and have massive amounts of PD. Instead, we fit with what's feasible given the district constraints. And their constraint was that they had 8 days of professional development during the school year, 1 a month. Sadly, even though we're working with specifically math coaches, much of that time was not math specific. There was 2 hours of those days, so 8 two-hour sessions across the school year. That was it. And I want to stress we've got this little character lurking in the bottom right of your screen. His name is Nick Kamansky, and when I talk about we in this work, it was Nick and myself. He was a doctoral student, but rather than have this typical relationship of supervisor, whatever, we worked very closely on this research problem together. But you'll see he did the heavy lifting in terms of actually analysing the data. But the rest of it was a genuine collaboration. In the PD, there were 15 mathematics coaches. Some were novice coaches, had just been recruited. Some were already working in the district. Why was this a problem? Because they had math coaches, but they came to the conclusion that they were not productive. And who were the they from the district side? The head person for mathematics instruction in the district, who I would tell you, in my humble opinion, was absolutely outstanding. We worked with a number of math specialists from different districts and 3 coaches. And so she realised what they were doing wasn't effective. And again, focusing on the middle grades. These are going to be coaches working in 12 to 14 year-old students. I will just tell you this work ended up sort of spreading across the grades. But right now, we made 2 design decisions, and it really was us together, rather than just Nick and I saying this is what you need to do. The goal was to support the coaches in being able to enact one-on-one coaching cycles effectively with teachers. So they meet with a teacher, they co-plan a lesson together, they then move to the classroom phase. The coach and teacher decide whether the teacher's going to teach the lesson, whether they're going to co-teach it, or whether the coach is going to teach it to model, for example, a particular aspect of instruction. After the lesson, they debrief, and again, in the course of that debriefing, they develop a goal for the teacher's improvement, if you know, what they're going to focus on in the teacher's instruction for the next cycle. So it cycles like that. That was the overall goal. Second decision we made to make this very practice-based. Yes, we had those 8 sessions. What happened after the first session, we wanted each of the participating coaches to identify a partner teacher for the year. Between the first and second session, they went and observed that teacher, And they then did a very, very informal interview with that teacher afterwards, just during which we suggested a range of things they found out about that teacher. What was this teacher's view or vision of what high quality instruction looks like? What was this teacher's view of their students' current mathematical capabilities? By which we meant, did they believe that if their kids were appropriately supported, they could engage in the sort of tasks that Kara was talking about before the break and so on? That was the first session. And then after that, between every session, they would do attempt to conduct a coaching cycle with their partner teacher and then bring records of what happened, their notes, copies of the student work, all of that kind of stuff back. So it's a two-way movement between RPD and what was happening in the school. And in addition, the first session we wanted to get them an overview of what was going of that coaching cycle. And then the second session, they've got this material back, they've observed the teacher, they've talked with the teacher, and we now say, let's identify a productive goal for your partner teacher. What do you and the teacher want to work on? And we had 2 criteria for a productive goal. If the teacher develops that, makes that change, develops that instructional practice, students' learning will improve immediately. And you saw examples of what we mean by a productive instructional practice before the break. And it's a feasible next step for the teacher. As it so happened, we got a real surprise here. We thought this would be very routine for these folks, these coaches. It absolutely was not. And so with that in mind, I want to talk to you about a case we used. We did a lot of case-based work, and this one is based on a real lesson that Kara and I had observed a couple of years earlier in a different district with a middle grades teacher. And this was a lesson from first part of a sequence in middle grades on volume. And the teacher selected a task that would be challenging for her students. She showed them this rectangular prism, and the task was to figure out the volume. The only thing to note is each of those cubes, the sides are 2 centimeters long. And she was looking for responses in terms of cubic centimeters. So that's the task. And what I'd like you to do first is to read how the teacher launched or introduced the task. And we know a bit about launches now. And that's on 4A in your packet. So quickly, just read through that. And then I'd like you to talk with a colleague when you have. And the question is going to be, given this launch, how do you think students worked on the task? How did they approach it? What sort of solution strategies might you get? Okay, let's come back together again. I'm sorry to have to cut the time short, but I'm looking at my watch, and I'm a noble person and want to make sure you have some lunch today. So I hope you had time to look at the launch and at least begin to engage in this problem. What I will tell you from what happened was the kids went and then worked on the task. We haven't got time to do it, sadly, but if you flip over to 4B, there are 4 basic types of solutions, and we've detailed them all there. If you look through them, to put it crudely, what the kids were trying to do is something with the numbers. One group found the area of each of the, quote, 3 sides and multiplied those, realized it was too big, they didn't know what to do about it. Another group focused on the cubes, figured out there were 6 cubes in the middle, meaning they weren't on any of the sides, and multiplied that number by one of the sides. This sort of thing was going on. What we can ask ourselves, what did kids take away from that launch? What did they think the task was? Perhaps they thought one of them said it's like area. They certainly knew they had to multiply. And if you look at these solutions, every group multiplied in some way, shape or form. There's no sense they had any sense at all that this was about space filling, this is about quantifying amount of space and so on. So that's the background. We used this task and gave them this case, we gave them that. The prospective coaches we're working with, they read exactly what you just read. They also read the whole class discussion at the end, What happened there is the teacher called on a group, they come up, they try to explain what they've done. The quote from the teacher's point of view was the wrong answer, but beyond that, the method doesn't make sense. She's trying to tutor them. The other kids are talking quietly to themselves. Same happens with the second group and the third group. We then asked our coaches, at that point they didn't see the student work. We said to them, what would you work on with this teacher? And what the huge surprise to us, I hope it's a surprise to some of you, was they all said on the whole class discussion. Why? On student questioning, the teacher's questions weren't very good. Now that in a way is true, but problematic from our perspective. Why? Because we look at where the problem was to start with. It was back with the launch and maybe even the task. Do we really need to have blocks that are 2 centimeters if the task is about an initial developing a conception of volume and quantification of volume, okay? So that's where we want to focus. So this was remember, our goal right now is to support these folks in developing productive goals for individual teachers. Goals that if they achieve them, if they make those improvements, will enhance the students' learning. So I'll just click through this, and this, for Nick and I, concentrated our thinking wonderfully. We did not anticipate this. This was also a learning opportunity for us. And it made us think through what are the conditions to have a productive whole class discussion. Well, 2 at a minimum. All students were able to work meaningfully on the task, exactly what Kerry was talking about as a criterion for a high quality launch. Why? Again, they don't have to have got the correct answer, but if they haven't engaged and wrestled with the mathematics involved, they will not be able to learn when hearing other students' solutions in that concluding whole class discussion. And that whole class discussion is a major learning event. It's not a social experience where you'll get up and have a chat, right? So that's critical. The second thing is they've again used that range of solutions on which the teacher can build. And so we focused on those criteria when we worked with our coaches. And then we started thinking more about it. We developed this notion if you want to identify a productive goals for teachers' learning, you have to figure out in the lesson where students' learning first broke down. We have to go back to the kids. Why would that lesson get designed? To support students' learning relative to particular learning goals. We've talked about, if we look at the whole class discussion at the end there, what has to happen? What has to happen in order for students to work meaningfully on the task? Well, there has to be those norms that Kara talked about. Crudely put, students have to know how to cooperate, not in general, cooperate to learn, be able to share tentative ideas, and if they disagree, not diminish each other, but engage at the level of the content. The teacher has to have launched the task effectively, otherwise they won't all be able to, and so on. Right back to the task. So I hope this makes sense. We actually developed a tool, and one of the things we're also investigating eventually was, would our coaches be able to learn to do this? Is this becoming a learnable practice? And that was the first year. We worked again with some of the same coaches and a different group of coaches the following school year. The last year before COVID, as it happens, when we had a school year. And we decided, Nick and I decided to do this as a full-blown design study, documenting what happened, so we could see if the coaches were indeed getting better, and if not, how we could improve how we were trying to support their learning. So we video recorded all 8 sessions, and we identified 5 focal coaches. I think 3 were new coaches, new to coaching, 2 had some experience but weren't necessarily accomplished coaches, and we documented the coaching cycles they conducted across the school year. And we ended up with 28 cycles. Clearly less than how many were conducted. Why? Some of them struggled to complete all phases because, for example, a principal would see them as a spare pair of hands. Somebody's ill, can you go and teach this class? When they'd scheduled a debrief, things like that. But the other reason is we wanted to collect a lot of data on each cycle. We audio recorded the planning meeting at the beginning and the debrief at the end. It wasn't possible to video the focal lesson but we developed a protocol specific to this study, an observation protocol, that focused on where does the students' learning break down in this lesson. So somebody reading the lesson notes would be able to figure that out, because that's how it was oriented. And we also wanted to know just not what coaches did, but why they did it. And there's 2 interviews that are critical for this study. The first one is after enactment, the classroom phase, and before the debrief. And we'd ask the coach, okay, you've been through the lesson, you've had a chance to think about it, hopefully you've looked at the student work. What are you planning to work on? What would you like to work on with this teacher? What do you see as a productive area for improvement, if you like? And then after that cycle, at the end of the debrief, we interviewed the coach again and said, what is the goal for the next cycle? In other words, you ended up with a goal. Was it the same as the one you started with or something different? And we also interviewed the teacher and said, what is the goal? What are you going to be working on the next cycle? What do you think it is? And do you think that goal is worthwhile? Are you committed to doing it? Or in effect, are you just cooperating and being kind and nice to the coach, if that makes sense? So those were our data that we looked at. And so that for each cycle. How did we determine whether the goal that the coach identified was productive? Well, Nick, God bless him, the first thing he did, let's put this back, was go back to those observation notes of the classroom and went through those to determine what were potentially productive goals before we looked at anything else. And what came out was quite surprising. First of all, he identified 3 approaches coaches use to identify a goal. They either went with the school district priority. And why did our coaches say, and they viewed it as a trivial question, what would you focus on with this teacher on the volume task? That was the district's priority for that year. Everybody's going to focus, all the coaches are going to focus on working with teachers on discussions. Or they just ask the teachers' opinions. They say, okay, because there's this view, we have to professionalize teaching, we have to reinforce, legitimize what teachers are going to do. So we focus on what they say. And if the teacher says questioning in whole class discussions, that's what they focus on. Or that was one method. The second one was a coach analysis of the lesson, but only focusing on instruction. And the way we've come to think of it is this. I'm a coach. I am a pretty darn good teacher, ambitious and equitable instruction. I really know my stuff. I've got a very sophisticated image of high quality teaching. And they use that as kind of a measure, a point of reference, and they look at the lesson and they see all these relative weaknesses. Well, wow, there's a weakness here in the launch, and there's a weakness here in the whole class discussion. And so they just choose one. It could be any one, if you see what I mean. And then the third method we've called a coach's analysis of the lesson, linking instruction and students' learning. And that's just what I illustrated, figuring out where students' learning first broke down in the lesson. So we've got those 3 methods, and then we want to know if they identify goals using the methods, were they productive or unproductive? And this is literally what came out. There was only 4 where they just went for the district's priorities or the teacher's preferences. None were productive. There were 10 where they focused only on instruction, using their own view as a point of reference. None were productive. I do want to say there could well have been 1 or 2 in there that were by happenstance, if you see what I mean. And then 14 did this sort of figuring out where students' learning broke, or tried to, and all of those were productive. Now the issue is, why does this matter? We think we only got those 14 folks who were linking instruction and student learning because of the PD. And why weren't they all? Because we were going across the school year, right? So the percentage of them focusing on linking instruction and student learning increased as the school year went on. The vast majority of coaches out there are either looking at teachers' preferences, district priorities, or just using their own view of instruction as the point of reference. The investment in coaching is not paying off. a very high percentage of the time, because they're not focusing on improvement goals that are going to enhance students' learning. I will just tell you also about our coaches. After we talked about, they talked through that volume lesson, we said to them at the end, could you conduct a productive whole class discussion given these student solutions? And you imagine what the solution, they said, no, we can't. So why are you focused? And that's when the penny dropped. But it's only when they thought about themselves actually having to build on those student solutions to support their learning. And they didn't. It's a different way of thinking. I told you this director of math industry is really, she's top notch. Kara and I worked with a number of them, and she's out there. So far above average, it's not true. And she took it for granted that we're all going to focus on whole class discussions. At least in the States, this is very deeply institutionalized. And so I'm trying to illustrate here also, not just tell you about coaching, but what we mean by digging into the things that really matter for kids' learning, the level of detail we have to get to, and we can get down to pretty small things that really have a big impact. I want to give you a second one. So we've got, what does the implications for coaching practice? Well, the action is going to be in the debrief meeting, because that's where these goals get sorted out and negotiated. When you look at what coaches typically do when they meet with a teacher to debrief, they focus on what? The instruction. That's their job. They're there to help the teachers get better. Therefore, you'll talk about instruction. But we saw how that misleads, right? Much more productive to, first of all, focus on the student's learning. Remember, this lesson was designed, they designed it, they had goals for students' learning, to then let's see what students actually learn. We're not just going to see if they all learned what we wanted or not, how many got it right and how many got it wrong. We want to understand what they learned, even if it's different from what we intended, because only once we've got a handle on what happened in student learning are we going to look at instruction. And we're going to look at instruction not to see if it fits with the coach's vision of high-quality instruction, but we're looking at instruction to explain why students learned what they learned in that lesson. And in doing so, against the background of students' learning, we're going to identify strengths in what the teacher did and also weaknesses, which opens up the possibility of identifying future goals. But there's one more thing we have to think about. What if the teacher, having gone through this process, wants to work on an unproductive goal or something different that the coach has in mind? We call that negotiating productive improvement goals. And because of the data, we had a chance to begin to look at that. What's involved in negotiating? Our criteria for a successful negotiation is the teacher has a voice in the decision. So ideally, the coach should ask the teacher and get the teacher's view on what you want to work on. The teacher and coach agree on a productive goal, and the coach considers that goal to be worthwhile. The coach is motivated, committed, whatever you want to see, to try and make that instructional teaching improvement. We had 14 cycles, if you remember, with productive goals. 4 of them, there's minimal negotiation. The teacher either the coach said, what about working on so-and-so? And the teacher said, yes, I think there was 2 of those. So the teacher didn't have a voice. Or the coach asked the teacher said such and such, and maybe it was productive order, but the coach accepted it. But there were 10 cycles in which the coach asked the teacher, what do you want to work on? And the teacher proposed an unproductive goal. 3 were unsuccessful negotiations and 7 were successful. And so Nick looked through and compared those. And you can imagine, this is not news, what an unsuccessful negotiation looks like. The coach asked the teacher. The teacher might say something like, I want to break the task down into small steps. The teacher proposes an unproductive goal in that case from our point of view for the very reasons Kara outlined before. The coach then says, alternative. I noticed that the kids really didn't struggled to figure out what to do. I think we should really work on the launch. The teacher sees no reason why that goal is better than the goal he or she's proposed. And either they just really, it's clear there's a tension as this goes on, or the teacher might acquiesce but really has no commitment to doing it. What's the difference between that and a productive, a successful negotiation? Let's start off, same again. Coach asks teacher what they want to work with. I want to break the problem down into small steps. Big step, simple as this, one move. This is really getting down into the weeds, but identifying what makes a difference for kids' learning. The coach asks the teacher, why? Why do you want to work on that? Not just, that's not what we're going to work on, it's unproductive. Why do you want to work on the unproductive thing? The teacher justifies that improvement goal in terms of a desired student development. This happened in all 7 cases. In this case, the teacher said, well, I really want to break this down because I'm really worried about my kids' confidence. I want them to become more confident in mathematics. A reasonable goal, right? Very feasible, decent. The coach comes back and says, that's really important. Yeah, we do want kids to be more productive. What about, I noticed that after you had introduced the task, many of them didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand the task. What if we work on how we improve launches, and that will help them become more confident? So in other words, we're going back to focusing on the students again, and it's the teacher who takes us there. It's legitimizing a goal the teacher has for students' development, and then suggesting an alternative means of achieving that goal, whether it's becoming more confident or whatever. And that was the pattern we saw in all successful negotiations. One thing I learned many things in this project. It was a great experience. But one thing that really hit me, we all say that teaching at the heart should be about students, it should be about students learning, but boy, it's hard to do some of the times. And I think a lot of the time in teacher education, we forget about the students. If you ask anybody in this district, why are you putting this money into coaching? Because we want to improve teaching. Why do you want to improve teaching? Because we want to improve students' learning. But in practice, boom, students' learning drops out of the picture. And the thing we have learned is always drill all the way back to the students and then work back out. So, remember we asked what the coaches need to know and do to be productive. This isn't complete, right? I haven't looked at what they need to have successful co-planning. How do they make principled decisions about whether to model, to co-teach, or whatever? But they need to be able to identify productive improvement goals for particular teachers. They need to be able to conduct productive debriefs, starting with what are the learning goals? What were we hoping kids would learn or develop? Which direction? Let's look at their work and see to what extent they got there and so on. We're trying to illustrate here evidence-based, we've tried some data, and sufficiently detailed. And as Kara tried to point out when she was talking about teaching this morning, it's not we get into details about everything. That's pathological. We figure out what matters for students' learning, and that's where we drill down. We pick our spots. Said before, I'm going to talk about coaching, but this has greater generality. Teacher collaborative meetings. A colleague of ours who worked with us on the MISS project, Ilana Horn, looked at a lot of video recordings of teacher collaborative meetings and developed a taxonomy. I think she has 5 different types, 2 of which are productive. Productive in that context means have the potential to support teachers' development of ambitious and equitable instruction. In those meetings, what did they do? They connected learning goals, students' reasoning, and teaching. So ingrained, I want to say instruction one more time. It's exactly that same pattern. A lot of those meetings, they were planning a lesson together. They were a grade level team of math teachers. So you have this same cycle. Lesson study has the same type structure, and I would imagine the same discourse pattern, exactly this as well. I want to stress the importance of this, going back to that MISS project. We were making recommendations to those districts every year. One of the major struggles for 3 of the 4 was they had very limited expertise, limited really experienced expert teachers to start with, let alone coaches. And we tried to communicate to district leaders that they've got 2 or 3 people in the central office who are really accomplished not only in teaching, but in supporting other teachers' learning. Those people are like gold. They're so rare on the ground, and they really have to figure out how to use that, how to leverage that expertise as critically as possible. And we were fortunate enough to work with a district math leader who realized that problem and wanted to support the development of a cadre of accomplished coaches. Why did we focus? Why don't we go and work with teachers? Why are we trying to support the development of coaches? We're interested, following on the MIST work, of instructional improvement at scale. This was a small-scale study, 2 of us, but we think it's relevant to instructional improvement at scale because we're trying to figure out what it takes to build up that district or that system capacity for instructional improvement. And that's why we focused on this. And so for us, it's really important that school systems dedicate significant resources, personnel, time, and so on, to developing cadres of accomplished professional learning leaders. And time? No, I'll skip it. So thank you very much. That's for both of us. And Kara and I will be happy to take questions. I wish we had more time for this. So give everybody a second.
That's it. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and this with how you develop teaching. I mean, you use the teachers developers. But I have a question about the selection of task, because to me, I was also thinking, what about students themselves designing tasks or finding problems? So is that also part of your design, that sometimes they do that, or is it always here? It's the teachers who design it. And also, I was thinking about in terms of you said that these tasks. It's kind of another question, but related. That the students you can enter it at different ways. So if there's a low entry, but is there a high ceiling? So if let's say some really smart kids, they can just do all kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to start on the first question?
I will take the last bit because I can actually answer it. And that's the low-high entry. Absolutely. It's not just that you want a low floor, you want a high ceiling. And so the sort of thing that happens, maybe not with that monkey's task, but similar tasks. So you have the figure imagery, and you even see kids counting in the air. Why weren't there manipulatives? Because the kids can already do it with manipulatives. And they're just counting. It's low level. It becomes procedural. But what the high-level kids do, especially when you move to larger numbers, is they're figuring out which combinations haven't come up yet. So they've now made themselves a higher-level task. So those are the sorts of things you're looking for. Do you want to say? I will say something about
the first question.
Yeah, you want me to?
Either way.
Okay. I'm going to take a very strong position on this, and I realise it's not going to be fashionable, and I apologise, but that's the way it is. Having done instructional design, I understand at some point we're not talking about teachers creating tasks. Certainly adapting them to their contexts, absolutely. But it is so hard to create coherent instructional sequences. And if I think of other professions, where, let's just, doctors making up surgeons making up techniques, this sort of thing. I mean, without going into gory, I've had hip replacements. I talk with these guys, there's a new technique. He doesn't make it. He has to go work with somebody who's already doing it. He has to do an apprenticeship experience, so to speak, with somebody who's already pretty good at it in other professions. And so I think we want to empower teachers, we want to professionalize teaching, and we do it by not just saying, hey, you can make up your own curriculum. We do it by empowering them with knowledge and skills and capabilities. So on the one hand, we want to have these high-quality instructional materials, but we're trying to communicate. It's really tough to use these well. This takes a lot of work over a couple of years to get really good at using these materials. We were just talking in the break about Japanese teachers. For them, they really had this all laid out, the curriculum. And they're talking about a 10 years apprenticeship before a teacher's fully blown capable. So I would suggest the way to professionalization is through developing these bodies of knowledge, these bodies of know-how, practical knowledge, not theoretical knowledge for its own sake, that differentiates teachers and what they know from just other people who think they know about teaching because they went to school. There's much more to it than that. And I would say the same for coaching. There's a massive amount to learn to be an accomplished professional learning leader beyond being an accomplished teacher. Right at the back there.
Thanks very much, Paul and Kara, for this. My name is Mogens. I would like to ask you about the ways in which you conceptualize the end goal of this endeavor. So, as you emphasized all the time, the outcome to be looked at is students' learning, improvements of students' learning. So, what are your ways of gauging that improvement? How is that related to your view of assessment?
How would we gauge it? There's lots of different levels, and I'll start us off. But as I said before, if I'm in a classroom, I gauge it by looking at the next lesson. In one lesson, you hoped students would make particular developments, and in effect, the next lesson is a conjecture about the developments they made. And so it's a test at that level. If we were to do a much more formal study, investigation, at some point, and we're not there yet to do this sort of thing, and we wanted to, and we're working at a system level, or at least at a school level, trying to support the capacity of instructional improvement within an organization, I think we would be looking, and I have no problem with doing formal quantitative studies in such an analysis. What would be critical would be design of the assessments. That would be very different from the formative assessments we had here. These would be summative assessments, perhaps comparing different districts. You have initial data or whatever, and you see where they are at the end. I would also want to have data on a lot of other stuff, though. I would want to have data on the nature of the teachers' practices, the coaches. I'd also want to know a lot about the role of those school leaders. We've focused on coaching or professional learning leaders here. We know, and there's a solid literature, at least in the US, the effectiveness of coaches is profoundly influenced by the school leaders, the buildings in which they work. To what extent they have some understanding of what they don't have to be coaches themselves or anything like that, but they have to understand what coaching is about and enable coaches to be successful in supporting teachers' learning. So ideally, I would want those multiple types of data. Other questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was a lovely, very interesting. I have a question about engagement, motivation, positive attitude. One big problem in math instruction is that kids at some point choose to turn away and don't really come back, right, to mathematics. And my guess is that this has also been a theme in your work, and I would like to know how. So not focusing on learning, but more like engagement.
You want to say something? Yeah. Okay, no, I want to say something.
Thank you for raising that question. Indeed, in our conversations, as Paul said, we engaged in interviews with all of the teachers over the years of the study, and this consistently came up as one of the challenges. And I think for us, and I learned this actually a lot from work Paul had done with earlier work around that issue of the perception of students as not being motivated, and then what do you attribute that to? So do you attribute it to a problem with the child, or do we attribute it to what's happening in the classroom or in the instructional system that is creating the conditions such that one would choose to be unmotivated to continue to engage in the work? And I think, Paul, you could probably speak to work where you've worked directly on that issue in the context of professional learning.
I was actually going to say something else because I want to broaden the question, if I may, and it's not fair, but that's life, which is student motivation, also teacher motivation, and so on. And what was striking to us on the MISS project, as I look back, these are good people, way above average. I don't remember one instance when they had a policy like, there's going to be teacher collaborative meetings, or this is going to happen, or we want that, where they ever thought about practitioner motivation. They never took it into account. And one thing we took away from that as a basic design issue is we also always have to think about why the person on the receiving end is going to see this is worthwhile. Not to manipulate them, but to see it's with their interest. And at least for teachers and also coaches, in our experience, the vast majority of teachers really care about their students. And if they come to realize something will benefit their students, that is typically very motivating. But I would say, as a basic design issue, whether it's professional development or whatever, to take account of practitioner motivation and view that the design has to nurture or foster that motivation.
So thank you a lot. I would like to ask you if the notion of systems of task, which could lead to local organization of results, of the students' results, have that played a role in your design?
In this project, I would tell us in the project we've reported here, both of them, we weren't actually designing instruction. We were looking at what other people were doing. 3 of the 4 districts we would say we worked with in MIST adopted the best available instructional materials that were commercially published in the United States at that time. We did look at, did that make a difference compared with the other district, the 4th district? Yeah, it did. The level of cognitive, the level of tasks that they implemented really was much higher in those 3 districts. The other district, the math specialists, the coaches were writing tasks to try and fill in. They weren't, but many teachers didn't use them. They were viewed as supplemental. The other thing why that was unfortunate, the coaches weren't teaching now. They left the schools. They're in the central office writing tasks. So we've looked at sequences of tasks in commercial books. In a previous life, I worked for many years at the classroom level with people from the Freudenthal Institute to design tasks. And so if this language makes sense, model of, model for transitions, all of that thing is critically important. We didn't open that box. But again, those coherent, if you come from that background of instructional design, you can see these characteristics in sequences. I looked at some instructional activities from Singapore, and I can see those model of, model for, there they are. I'm sure they don't come, they maybe reinvented them themselves, but you see exactly these same ideas there, where where representations in mathematics become tools to support students' learning. Now that's the best I can say about that, but we made this shift, and it was hard for me to do, I have to tell you, because I loved working at the classroom level, we're now up 2 levels, because we're interested in scale.
Yeah, thank you to Paul and Kara.